Let's talk about adjustment layers. And adjustment layers are found at the bottom of the layers panel. Well, they can also be found in the adjustments panel, but I find the easiest place to get your adjustment layers is the bottom of the layers panel. There's a little half white, half gray circle at the bottom. And when you click on it, all these adjustment layers pop up. Let's take a look at curves. Another place you can get adjustment layers from is the adjustments panel at the top. And you can see all these different icons here, but unless you know what the icons mean, you have to hover over top of them and you'll see the name of the adjustment layer at the top there. I find the layers panel with that little pop-up at the bottom is about as easy as anything. And if you go to the curves adjustment layer, that one will look a little bit different. The levels adjustment layer looked similar. You have the histogram in there. You had a black point and a white point, and those will all work exactly the same as they did in levels. If I were to pull that black point up, you'd see the shadows filling in. If I pulled the white point down, you'd see the highlights filling in. The difference here is you'll notice that there's no middle slider. With levels, I could grab that middle slider. Let me just show you levels for a second. With levels, I could grab that middle slider and I could lighten or darken the image. Curves, it's a little bit different. With curves, there's this 45-degree line. And any point on that 45-degree line, and you can see here's our black point, here's our white point, and there's also a second axis up here. We have black and white. This is your input. This is how much information or how bright the pixel is supposed to be. And up this axis is your output. So if we had an input of 0, well, we have an output also of 0. Over here, if we had an input of 255, so if it was supposed to be white, we have an output of, well, 255. If it was supposed to be 128, right in the middle there at the input, we have an output of also 128. So anything on this 45-degree line means no change. But if I were to grab the middle of this line and pull upwards, or the middle of this curve, we could start, if I pulled up, we could brighten the image. If I grab this middle part and I start hefting upwards, you'll notice that the image, if I turn the eyeball on, gets overall brighter, which makes sense. Having taken this midpoint here, what used to have an input of 128, or right in between black and white, now has an output of, I gotta make this panel bigger so I can actually see it. But it'll tell you what the output levels are. If I pull this down, there we go. That's a bit better to see. My input of let me get that 128 there. There. Now has an output of 192. So it's gotten brighter. It's gotten closer to 255. Now the cool thing about curves, with levels, we can grab that middle slider and pulling it left or right did the same thing. It made the image brighter or darker. But with curves, we can choose what parts of the image we make brighter and what parts of the image we make darker. So if we wanted to play around with the contrast of this image, maybe we wanted the highlights to get a little bit brighter and the shadows to get a little bit darker. Well, having pulled the middle part up, everything got brighter. But what if, and we can move these little points on the curve here, what if I had a point on the curve that was pulling upwards and another point further down the curve that was pulling downwards? I could brighten the highlights. And watch this. I can grab this curve, slide it along the line wherever I want it to go, and by pulling this part up, the highlights, anything getting close to 255, have gotten brighter. The shadows, if I click again, it puts a second point on the curve. And as I pull down, so I'm putting what we call an S-curve onto this, I'm darkening the shadows. So we can play around with the contrast of the image that way. So let's say you've got a landscape photograph and there's some fantastic clouds in the sky, but they're really bright. You're not seeing the detail in them as well as you would like to have. With this, you could grab the highlights, and the clouds would probably be up here, close to white. If I grabbed the highlights and pulled down, I could darken down those clouds. And then maybe in the forest, there were some trees down there, and there's the trunks of the trees and all the shadows in the forest. And in those deep shadows, there were some wolves kind of hiding out in the forest. But it was really, really dark, and I could just barely see them. If they were really dark, they might be down around in here. Here's 0. They might be like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but they're just too dark to see. If I grab this little curve and pull upwards, I could say, well, let's lighten the shadows of the image, darken the highlights. So now we have better looking clouds, more open shadows. I can see what's going on in there. And we can take this to extreme. Actually, give that a try. Put a couple points on that line and heft them up and down. You could do silly things like this if you wanted to. If you pull it into a squiggly line, look at what I've told it. Anything that is kind of darkish, whoa, becomes really bright, almost white. Anything that used to be really bright, I can make it really dark. Watch this. And this kind of stuff was really popular early 90s when Photoshop and stuff like that first became common, you see people doing this where they just do a big curves adjustment and then like call it art. It is fun. I don't know if I call it art, but play around with it. And you'll notice that when we're in this RGB channel up here, if we just do a simple lightening or darkening, it doesn't change the color of the image. Take a look on the screen for a second. I'm just going to turn this off. I'm just going to make another curves adjustment layer here. And if I just grab the middle slider and I pull upwards, notice how the entire image gets brighter. And if I pull down, the entire image gets darker. All of the color channels are being affected at the same time. But look at this. Right now it says RGB. This is adjusting my red, green, and blue composite channel. If I were to pop down to just the red channel, I could increase the amount of red, and notice it gets a fairly red cast to it, or I could decrease the amount of red, and it gets a cyan cast, cyan being the opposite of red. And I could do that on the other channels as well. So you've got an image that's a little bit off color, maybe it's a little bit too green or a little bit too reddish or a little bit too yellow. Flip through the color channels, find which channel is appropriate, and you can brighten or darken that channel. And it doesn't have to be curves for the lightening or darkening, levels can work as well. Now the cool thing about the adjustment layers is they aren't actually doing anything to your image. If you look at it, you're like, well, clearly it is. My image is turning green here, and you may have done something wacky that makes it look like it's like something from space, but turn off the eyeball on the adjustment layer. When you turn that eyeball off, you can see that it's not actually doing anything to the image. It hasn't changed any of the pixels down below. And we call this non-destructive because if the client called back the next week and said, oh, it's great, but it's a little bit too dark, can you lighten it up a bit? If you had done that directly to the pixels, let's say I had, and I thought that maybe it was a little bit too bright. So I said, I'm going to darken this image down. So I go under Image, Adjustments, and maybe I use Curves, and I pull that brightness down. There we go. That's the way we want it to look. And then the client calls up next week and says, a little too dark. Can you lighten it up a bit? I say, oh, no problem. Image adjustments. I'll just pop back into levels here and brighten it up. Look at what's starting to happen. We're getting some speckling, well, there's basically some damage done to the file. When I darkened it down, remember I said when you grab that middle bead and pull it to the left or the right, some of those beads or some of those shades of gray in the histogram pop off the string. You lose them. If you then pull it the other direction, you're not undoing the damage, you're compounding the damage. And with the adjustment layers, if I had used an adjustment layer for this instead, let me just revert back out of this. File, revert. And I'd used a curves adjustment layer to darken it down, or a levels adjustment layer, either or. And then I save that up as a layered PSD file, and then the client calls back next week and says, yeah, it's great, but it's a little bit too dark. Can you lighten it up? No problem. I'll just go back to my curves adjustment layer. Look at that. It's right where I left it. And like I said, no damage has actually been done to the image. I've never actually darkened it. It's almost like a pair of sunglasses. It doesn't actually make the image darker. Just like putting sunglasses on doesn't actually make it darker outside. If you walk outside and put some sunglasses on, people around you don't go, what happened, right? It's only you that sees it darker. Same thing with this. And if you take the sunglasses off, or if I turn the adjustment layer off, nothing's been done. So if the client says it's too dark, can you lighten it up? I pop back into my curves layer. There's that right where I left it. I ease it back towards no change, or I could even make it brighter. And if I do it crazy bright, well, that looks like an awful lot of damage that's been done to that file, doesn't it? Except nothing's actually being done. I can grab that slider and put it back where it was. So adjustment layers are fantastic for making non-destructive changes to things. And as you can see, there's a whole lot of them. Solid color fills it with a solid color. Gradient fills it with a gradient. What's a gradient? It's a transition from one thing to another. Could be from black to white, could be from red to blue, could be from hot to cold. It could be from, well, when you get your assignments back, you have a certain grade assigned to it. And that's just basically placed somewhere on a gradient from 0 to 100. So your grade is part of a gradient. Brightness and contrast. I wouldn't use brightness and contrast so much. A lot of people go right to it because they say, well, I want to change either the brightness or the contrast of this image. The downside to it is, it doesn't give you any feedback as to whether or not you're starting to lose highlight information or lose shadow information. If I throw on a brightness and contrast here, I can change the brightness, but at what point have I started losing highlight information? Or if I darken it, at what point have I started filling in my shadows? You don't get a whole lot of feedback in terms of damage that might be being done to the image. A better way of changing the brightness and contrast would be curves. Here's your brightness, up, down. Here's your contrast, higher, lower. And we can see in the histogram, if I really start, say I really brightened up this image here. If I take it too far, look at what starts to happen. See that flattening out on the top of the curve? This is where everything from here down to this, all of this information has blown out to white. And I can kind of see it happening in here, but this gives me visual confirmation that yes, I'm losing all of this highlight information. And the same thing if I was darkening. If I get a big flat spot across here, I know I'm losing all of that shadow information. Brightness and contrast, you don't really get that, but you can do the same thing with curves. The other adjustment layers, I'm not going to go through them all. We'll kind of blast through them a little bit quickly there. Levels and curves we talked about. Exposure I wouldn't use either. It's more meant for 32-bit HDR images, which we are not working on. Vibrance. Ooh, that's actually kind of an interesting one. Let me just throw these out for a second. Anybody know what saturation refers to when we're talking about colors or images? How much intensity or how pure the colors are. Usually brightness is kind of like how light the colors are. Saturation is how close to pure they are. And if I just bring up the saturation, let's say I threw on like a hue and saturation adjustment layer, and I said, let's make this image higher in saturation. There's a hue and saturation. I can grab the saturation and ease it up. You'll notice that the skin colors start going wacky pretty fast. There's pretty good skin colors, and oh, they just went weird really quick. And things like the asphalt got really bizarre. Like if I really crank it, everything becomes the most pure version of whatever color it is. So we know now that this is mostly a slightly bluish tinge with some slight hints of a magenta tinge because, well, there they are, bluish, magenta-ish. This is red. Her skin was also red. So saturation just pushes the saturation towards that most pure version of whatever color it is. Vibrance, we'll try to avoid things like skin tones. If I bring up the vibrance here, notice how everything got a bit of a more saturated look, but it avoided the skin, and it didn't push those weird colors into the asphalt there. So that's the vibrance slider. Now the hue and saturation, this one's kind of interesting. If I needed to make a black and white version of an image, I could simply pull the saturation down, couldn't I? Look at that, it's black and white. There's before, and there's after. Now, do you think this is the best way to make a black and white image? Well, take a look at the image here. The yellow lines on the road, you can see the yellow lines, excellent. You don't see them so well up here. The contrast of this image, once it's converted to black and white, is such that the yellow and the asphalt came out to be fairly similar shades of gray. And the helmet and the shirt are fairly similar as well. Let's say you're doing a job for a flower shop, and there's this beautiful bouquet of flowers that has some roses, nice red roses, and some blue flowers, and some purple flowers, and some green leaves. And you take a photograph of it for a newspaper ad where it's going to be printed in black and white. And you notice when you print it that, oh, the green of the leaves, the red of the roses, the purple of the purple flowers, it's all coming out the same shade of gray. The contrast of that image isn't great. Now, back in the days of film, that's pretty much what you were limited to. I don't know if I mentioned, but I'm like really, really old. And when I was in college, it was all film-based. And we actually had an assignment where we had to play around with the contrast of images in black and white. How could you, do you think, let's say it was just roses and the green leaves. And you take that black and white photograph, and the red of the rose and the green of the leaves comes out to the same shade of gray. So you've got kind of a grayish rose shape and grayish leaf shape, but the contrast between the two, they're the same shade of gray. What do you think you could do if you're shooting black and white film to make those roses stand out against those leaves? What if you put a red filter over your lens? What does a filter do? It filters light, it blocks light out. So a red filter would let red light pass through, but it would block greens and blues and basically anything other than red. So the light that reflects off the rose would pass through, the light that reflects off the leaves would kind of get blocked, and the rose would appear to be a little bit brighter. So you had to do that on the camera. You actually put the filters on because once you'd taken the photograph, that's what was on the film. But with Photoshop, we have a little bit more control. Instead of simply desaturating that image, give this a try. Call up the image called IMG0287 in the black and white folder. And in the adjustment layer pop-up, call up one called, are you ready for this? Black and white. They like to give them very cryptic names, they do. And when you throw on the black and white adjustment layer, well, it just turned black and white again, didn't it? Which is the same thing that desaturating it was doing. Except, look at what we've got over here. we can isolate colors within the image. So I know that she's wearing a blue helmet and kind of a reddish shirt, so maybe I want the helmet and the shirt to contrast against each other. I could go into the blues here, maybe the blues and the cyans. Let's play around with the blues. Oh, blues lightens the helmet, cyan also. So I could play maybe the helmet a bit lighter. And the shirt, which would be in, I guess, the reds, there we go, darker reds. Maybe they want to be able to see those lines on the road a little bit better. If I go into the yellows here, I can lighten up those lines. Or I could darken them down for a bit of a more menacing sort of look. So this is like putting filters on your camera when you're shooting black and white. You've got a lot of control over how that conversion is going to take place. And again, the super cool thing about this is it's an adjustment layer. It's not actually changing the color of your image. Turn off the eyeball of that adjustment layer. You'll see that all the colors are still there. And if you want to go super tacky, if I did want to bring back some of the color in this image, let's say I took a paintbrush and some black paint, whoops, I could bring back just the blue of the helmet. Or, like I said, with the, the kids, it would be like, the little boy would be handing a bunch of flowers to the little girl, and everything would be black and white except for the bouquet of roses. So this layer mask attached to the adjustment layer gives you the ability to hide the effect of that adjustment layer in certain areas. Now, this would typically be considered to be extremely tacky, so use it with discretion. But as far as making black and white conversions go, this is probably your best bet. And with some of the colors that are available, sometimes with skin tones as well, you can make people look a little bit more tanned or a little bit lighter. And I'll just quickly go over some of the other adjustment layers. One of them is gradient map, which can have some really weird effects. It will basically map a gradient onto your image. So if you had a black and white picture where you have, black shadows and white highlights, and you mapped a black to white gradient on it, nothing would happen. If you mapped a red to white gradient on it, you would end up with an image that has red instead of black for the shadows and going through lighter shades of pink till you get to white. If you'd mapped red to blue onto it, you would have an image that has red shadows, blue highlights, and purplish midtones, where all those colors sort of mix together. So an odd sort of thing. I can't think of anything you would do for photographically making it look realistic. Photo filter is an adjustment layer that, well, simulates photo filters. Back in the days of film, like I said, you had to put a filter on the front of your lens to play around with the contrast or the color of an image. One of them was a warming filter. So if you're shooting during the day where everything has a very neutral sort of look, people tend to look a little bit better with a warmer sort of tone on them. So by putting a warming filter, you could get a bit of a, almost like that golden hour. Just as the sun's going down, you get those nice orange color coming from the sky. So those different photo filters that photographers were used to using. That being said, pretty much any of these effects you can also get from levels and curves. And the fewer adjustment layers you use, the better off you are. And let me show you why. I'm going to call this image, well, I'm going to call this image here up. And let's say I used a levels adjustment layer to lighten this image up. So I call it my levels. And there's the histogram for this image. You can see that it's a fairly dark image overall with some really bright areas up top. And sure enough, big mountain range down below the 50% gray. Most things are kind of towards the darker end. Some lighter tones and a big spike on the right side, which is this white cloud up here. And I use this to lighten up the image. If I needed to darken it down, there's been some damage done to this file. It's not permanent damage because this is just an adjustment layer. So if the client called back and said it's too bright, can you darken it? I should go back to this levels, grab this slider, and pull it down. And here's why. Take a look at what happens if I use another adjustment layer to try to darken that image. I said, okay, you want it darker? I'll just throw on a levels. And, oh, look at this. You can see that damage that's been done to that histogram. Here's where the pixels got stretched out, or those glass beads got stretched out on the string, and we're seeing these gaps appearing in between them. Over here is where a bead popped off the string, and any pixels that were using that shade of gray stacked up with their neighbors, and you're getting these spiking effects. So, okay, well, I'll just darken her back down. There we go. I haven't undone the damage. If I look at another adjustment layer, I've actually compounded it. So if you start using multiple adjustment layers, and I've seen students where they'll throw on like a curves adjustment layer and they'll use that to brighten up the image. And then they'll throw on a levels and try to darken it down. The more you do this kind of stuff, the more damage you're doing to the image. And if you get in there, you can start seeing extra noise, extra graininess in there. Sometimes you can get what's called posterizing or banding in the image, where instead of a nice smooth gradient, here we're mostly just seeing extra noise, and we've lost a lot of information. See around here where this, we've lost the details in the tree here. But sometimes, instead of a nice smooth gradient from light tones to dark tones, you start seeing these distinct transition edges, these bands. I think we're not seeing them on this image because it was fairly noisy, but I have another image that I did a while ago just to kind of show this off. Let me show you what that banding looks like. Here's an example of an image that, you can see it's a nice smooth gradient from the sunset all the way up into the sky up there. But if I throw on a levels to try to brighten it, and then another levels to try to darken it, oh, look at what's happening. Those are those individual transitions between those shades of gray. And yeah, it gets pretty noticeable. So be careful if you're doing adjustments. Try to use a minimum number of adjustment layers. So don't throw on like a levels to try to brighten it, and then maybe throw on a curves to try to darken it, and then throw on an exposure to try to lighten it again. If you have to make some changes, go back to an already existing adjustment layer. So if you want to do a little bit of color correction, you already have a curves layer on there, go back to that curves layer.